Addressing Author Misconduct, the Role of Researchers, Journals, and Institutions. This is the first of 4 events in the Research Without Borders Speaker Series for 2012-2013 academic year. This event is co-sponsored by Columbia's Scholarly Communication Program and the Office of Research Compliance and Training. My name is Arthur Palmer. I'm professor in the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biophysics at Columbia, and I also serve as the Associate Dean for Graduate Affairs in Columbia University Medical Center. I'm Editor-in-Chief of Biomolecular NMR Assignments, Associate Editor of the Journal of Biomolecular NMR, Electronic Editor of Protein Science, and I serve on editorial boards for the Journal of Molecular Biology, the Journal of Magnetic Resonance and Structure. So you can see I have a reason to be highly interested in today's panel. Now, today's presentations will have the following format. Each speaker will make a presentation of approximately 15 minutes, and after that, we'll open up the floor for discussion and questions for the audience. So I ask that you hold your questions until all of the speakers have completed their presentations. Also, today's event is being webcast and videotaped, so when you ask a question, please move to the microphone that should be in the middle of the room so that you'll be audible on the videotape and on the webcast. So now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Katja Brose is editor of the journal Neuron and executive editor of the neuroscience portfolio at Cell Press. She received the PhD in biochemistry from UCSF and joined Cell Press in 2000. Dr. Brose was appointed editorial director of review strategy at Cell Press in 2011, overseeing the Trends group of review journals. Cell Press is an imprint of Elsevier and publishes 28 journals spanning the life sciences. Our second speaker is Martin Frank. He's the executive director of the American Physiological Society since 1985. He received a PhD in physiology and biophysics from University of Illinois in Urbana. And prior to joining APS, Dr. Frank held faculty appointments at research universities and positions at the NIH and the Department of Health and Human Services. Liz Williams received her PhD in 2004 from Cornell University and began her career in scientific publishing in 2008 as associate editor for PLOS Biology. She joined the Journal of Cell Biology as executive editor in 2010. The Journal of Cell Biology is published by the Rockefeller University Press and has been an industry leader in development of standards for image data presentation and for pre-publication screening to detect misconduct. And finally, Naomi Schrag is the Associate Vice President for Research Compliance in Columbia University's Office of the Executive Vice President for Research. Ms. Schrag received her law degree from NYU and joined Columbia in 2006. She oversees work on issues such as research misconduct, conflict of interest, and international research compliance. Ms. Schrag also collaborates closely with other offices across the university to develop integrated approaches to compliance and training. So with that introduction, we'll start then with Dr. Brose.
Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me here today. And this is a topic which most of us who work in publishing are really thinking about a lot these days and spending a lot of time on. So it's great to be able to both present and get ideas what we as publishers could be doing better. So just a bit of background about myself. I'm an editor at Neuron, which is a part of Cell Press. So a lot of what I tried to put in my presentation is meant to be fairly general. There's portions at the end that will talk a bit about how we handle accusations and allegations of misconduct at Neuron and Cell Press. I should say just in advance that some of the ways that we handle things may be general to other publishers, but I think part of the issues in this field are that there aren't general standards for how publishers and institutions should handle cases that come to rise. And so I'll just give you the note in advance that this, I speak for Cell Press and for Neuron, but probably not much beyond that. I have sort of three messages that I want to bring out in the talk, and there'll be a bit of an overview introduction. So first is to define the problem. So before we can solve a problem, we're all scientists, we need to know what the problem is. So what is research misconduct and why is it a problem? And this may seem like an obvious, but in fact, I think that when we discuss misconduct, there's a wide variance in what people consider misconduct to be. I'll talk a bit about current publishing policies and approaches related to ethics and misconduct, and then towards the end, maybe lay out some opinions on how we can start to address misconduct, both in terms of what publishers, institutions, and other bodies can do to sort of weed out misconduct, but maybe what we as a scientific community can also do to try to prevent misconduct in the first place. So defining the problem, what is research misconduct and why is it a problem? This is just some clippings within the last couple years from the press. And the view from the press box seems to be these days that there's a crisis in science, not just science publishing, but in science, and that fraud is rampant. There's more and more cases that come to light and get quite a bit of high-profile exposure. The cancer genomics case at Duke in the last year or so. There was the Michael Hauser case at Harvard, the Korean stem cell case a number of years ago. And if you're reading all this, or if you're the public that funds us, you may think, what are these scientists up to? Is just fraud running rampant in the field? There haven't been a lot of studies to even try to put some numbers on whether misconduct is actually on the rise. Is it on the rise, or is there just a perception that it's on the rise? One thing that has been tracked, and these two images are from what was a very nice overview piece from Carl Zimmer in the New York Times earlier this year, that has looked at retractions. And retractions are sort of documented to be on the rise. So one number that's been put out is that retractions have gone up tenfold, while the number of publications has gone up only 40%. So retractions are certainly on the increase. Some other studies have looked at sort of in the cases where retractions can be analyzed through various meta-analyses and documented as to what the retraction stemmed from, are the instances of fraud leading to retraction up on the rise. And that's less clear as a percentage. As indicated simply by the reason that's given in retraction statements, still only less than 40%, sometimes less than 30% of retractions are through something that's documented as fraud or misconduct, as opposed to honest errors, issues of reproducibility, and things like that. So is misconduct on the rise, or is this a case of a few high-profile rogue cases, or even just a better ability to ferret out fraud? Do we have a deeper problem within the scientific community? So one, as I've already told you, it's difficult to measure how much misconduct there is. We can talk about publications, but publications are only one part of research misconduct. As it happens, the number of retracted papers is still only a very small proportion of all of the science that's published, so less than 0.02%. There are more scientists and there are more papers, but the growth in retraction seems to be outpacing the growth in the number of papers, so that suggests that there may be a problem. There's much more activism within the lay press and the community to really root out misconduct. Some of that is just the nature of the internet. You can find these things quite readily. Blogs like Retraction Watch are out there looking for issues and looking to bring them to light. And there's more sort of online technology resources that can ferret out things like plagiarism, figure reproduction. There are also more concerted efforts by journals and publishers to police misconduct and ethics violations. Retractions are occurring faster, and they're really reaching back deeply into the literature. So, certainly at Cell Press, we have had allegations come to light about things like plagiarism and figure manipulation that go way back because you can pick these things out now. And as I said, digital electronic media makes it easier to detect some kinds of fraud and plagiarism, but I think it's important to point out that there's types of fraud and plagiarism that are much deeper than what you can detect with the current online resources. And I think there's some evidence, perhaps anecdotally, that there are more minor cases of what we would call questionable conduct, so sloppiness, honest errors, and more of these are coming to light. And certainly, I think as an editor, I'm seeing more of those in the pre-publication review process. And, again, some forms of ethically questionable practice seem more widespread in the community. There's been some studies that based on self-reports and surveys of scientists that, by the scientists' own mouths, seem to suggest that kind of questionable practices are, in some places, sort of more accepted as the norm. So does that then translate down the road to more retractions and more cases of misconduct? So what is research misconduct? I mean, one message that I think is important to put out there is that there isn't one specific agreed-upon definition for research misconduct. There is a common definition that is put forth by the U.S. Public Health Service and the Office of Research Integrity that sort of isolates out 3 large classes of research misconduct, including fabrication, falsification, plagiarism. And I think most institutions, not just in the United States, but also in other parts of the world, sort of go by those guidelines that we're talking about fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism, usually with an intent to deceive. So the definitions of research misconduct generally make some allowance for honest error or differences of opinion. And something like the inability to replicate in the case of some studies may not be considered as misconduct. So if that's the sort of hard and fast definition of research misconduct, which I would question whether all would agree that that's even the hard and fast definition, there's a whole range of more gray zone situations that are, I think, what people would put into the category of questionable research practices. And these are things like failure to get ethics approval for animals and subjects, selective use of statistics, ignoring outliers in your data set, removing data, hiding data, not disclosing conflicts of interest, poor data management, authorship issues, redundant publications. So whether these count as sort of official misconduct, I think, is definitely more of a gray zone. And these are the cases that I think become really troubling and difficult for editors and publishers to deal with. So a couple bullet points to take away is, again, sort of the official definition of misconduct usually implies some level of intent, but intent can be hard to prove. It leaves room for honest errors or mistakes, but it's not meant to be a justification for sloppy science. And at what point does sloppy science become, close to willful intent? And again, when we talk about research misconduct versus publication misconduct, most research misconduct begins well before the paper. And by the time an editor, a publisher, or a reviewer sees the paper, the damage has already been done. So, I think we need to sort of broaden where we start looking at research misconduct beyond simply the journals. However, it's also fair to say that most research misconduct is really only caught when it's published, so this puts more attention on publication misconduct. So what are some common misconduct situations that arise for publishers? And one thing that I had given this talk before and had the list of all the things that an author could do that are unethical. And I wanted to just put out there up front that authors are obviously not the only component in the publication process. Reviewers and editors, too, have ethical guidelines that they need to hold to. For the purposes of this talk, I'm focusing mostly on author misconduct, but that's not meant to imply that authors are the only individuals in the game who are capable of misconduct. So the main things that we've been seeing, I can say again at Cell Press and Neuron, are issues of figure manipulation or falsification. And Liz is going to talk more about that, so I won't really get into that too much. Data falsification or fraud. Plagiarism. Plagiarism comes up both for primary research journals, but also for reviews titles. Duplicate and redundant publication or self-plagiarism, which is, again, quite in this gray zone. So as an author, if you're reusing your own words, is that a problem? And people definitely have different opinions on this. Conflicts of interest, financial, professional, personal, the whole gamut of potential conflicts. Authorship conflicts come up not infrequently for editors, so either an author who shouldn't be on the paper or an author who was left off of the paper. Failure to provide a published reagent, which for at least Cell Press and most titles, I believe, elsewhere, is that a condition of publication is open access to reagents that are used or published in that paper, and the failure to provide that is, we consider that an ethics violation. Generally unethical research, so violation of either legal or ethical guidelines for subjects or materials. And again, outside of author misconduct, certainly reviewer misconduct is something that is very important for editors to police. And of course, we as editors also have ethical guidelines that we need to hold ourselves to. So what are the journals doing about detecting and dealing with cases of misconduct when they arise? As editors and publishers, so our ethical obligation to the scientific community and to the publishing process is, one, to support the quality and ethics of the review process itself, so pre-publication to weed out and prevent cases of fraud or misconduct. And two, to ensure the correctness of the published literature once it's out there. So we feel we have an obligation post-publication to both correct and appropriately communicate cases of correction. So I've included here just some examples of things that publishers do generally to support these two ethical obligations that we have as publishers. So one is most journals and publishing houses have systems and procedures in place for investigating and addressing situations of misconduct. I will say that varies across publishers, and even within Cell Press, I'd say that our systems and procedures have evolved, largely in parallel to situations that we've seen coming up. There is cooperation with investigations from institutions and from funding bodies. There's probably less cooperation between publishing houses. So at Cell Press, as a part of Elsevier, we're heavily integrated into the other processes at Elsevier, but we certainly at Cell Press don't spend a lot of time talking in detail about processes for vetting these sorts of situations with other publishers. Most journals have author and reviewer guidelines for appropriate ethical conduct, and authors are usually asked to sign off on an understanding of those guidelines as a requirement for publication. Some journals have routine screening on various parameters. So Journal of Cell Biology, Liz will talk about their pre-screenings. So either for figures, some journals use cross-ref and cross-check for detecting plagiarism in text. Some journals have put out policies for random screening of certain types of papers. So in response to the Korean stem cell situation a number of years ago, Science put out a policy that they let it be known that they would potentially be implementing heavier screening of papers in certain kinds of fields, hot topics, extraordinary claims. And I think most publishers have some sorts of efforts like this to contribute to the education and the development of community standards, either through editorials, workshops, working with other organizations in the scientific community to set standards. So how do we address an allegation of publication misconduct? What I'll give you here is just kind of a walkthrough of what we do at Cell Press when something comes up. And I think probably elements of this apply to other publishers, but again, by no means do I speak for everyone. So our first course is usually, so when we get an allegation, and more typically these days the way it comes in is maybe an anonymous reader. In some cases it might be a reviewer, but if we're talking post-publication it's usually an anonymous reader. In some cases it's a member of the lab, sometimes anonymously, sometimes with a name. But an allegation is made, and so what's our first step? So our first step is usually to proceed with some level of caution. So we take these allegations incredibly seriously. Everyone is vetted, but we also appreciate that not every allegation will turn out to be true, and these kinds of cases, including just the investigation, can be incredibly damaging to the scientists involved, whether it's the scientist who's being accused head-on or the collateral damage for other authors on the paper. So trying to, at least in the beginning, sort of dive in the middle and be fair to the authors but fair to the allegation. We initially start with contact and initial discussion with the authors and reviewers that's fairly low level. This situation has come up, can you give me a response? From there, it usually branches out that you start to get a sense pretty quickly as to whether there's something real here. Some authors, and usually it's corresponding author that you're dealing with, may be caught completely unawares, but when talking to the postdoc or the student or looking at the allegation itself, we'll see that a mistake was made and we'll come right to the table and say, we've got to fix this. And others, the extreme version of others is some obfuscation and, what are you accusing me of? And you can start to, as an editor, kind of guide your way through that. As these things get more serious, we will go towards notifying the authors, department, university, institution, funding agency, or government agencies like the ORI, as is appropriate to the case. We don't, at Cell Press currently, we have a certain level of investigation of the claims, but to a large degree that's left up to investigating bodies at either the institution, the funding agency, or if it got to the point of the ORI, but we don't have a mechanism for that right now at Cell Press. This is changing, and journal and publishers, I think, are taking more of this head on. but we usually do try to work together with the institution and funding agencies. Government agencies, like I said, can get involved in arbitrary allegations of misconduct. In the U.S., this is ORI. It gets way more complicated when you get out of the U.S. because most countries don't have an agency like that. In fact, it gets hard to even know where to go for some of the funding agencies. We consult with appropriate advisory sources if necessary, so whether it's internal at Elsevier, I mean, certainly we would get involved with our legal team if that is needed. We may bring the case for, agencies like COPE have advisory boards that will help it's not so much an arbitration, but a way to get advice on particular situations, so we may do that. And in some cases, if an investigation looks like it's going to be ongoing for a while and that we're not going to be able to resolve the situation cleanly in short order, and we feel there's a need to notify the community that something is up with this paper, we may publish a note of editorial concern to alert the community. That's something that you probably saw in the Michael Hauser case from Harvard that Science did. Other papers like that would come up as well. I think it's not so common. It really is specific to a certain circumstance, but that's an option for a publisher. What do we do if we actually get through the investigation, we and/or the investigating agency find hard evidence for misconduct and fraud? So if it's prior to publication, so i.e. during the review process, the manuscript can be withdrawn from review. The big kind of black box there is some authors will take that and just submit it to the next journal. So that's an issue that I think we as a community have to deal with. Post-publication, there are a number of recourses that we have. We can retract the paper. We can, as I mentioned earlier, not retract the paper, so let it stand in the literature, but perhaps cite a note of editorial concern. That might be something you would do in a case where it isn't so clear that there was misconduct and that in the end the investigation did not decide on the side of either that they've been absolved or shown to be fraudulent. And we might also publish an errata or correction. So in a case, for instance, where there is perhaps some of these honest errors that need to be corrected but are not sort of sufficient to withdraw or retract the paper, we may publish an errata or correction. If an errata is shown to be the case, a paper is usually marked in the literature in PubMed. It's tagged so that future readers can tell that there's an errata. If it's retracted, it's similarly marked in PubMed as retracted. The issue of when to retract versus correct is very difficult, and I think it does again get into this issue of is it fraud or an honest mistake? To what extent does even the honest mistake, or in some cases the honest mistakes, really take down the conclusions of the paper? To what extent is the data fully incorrect or misleading, or is it something that can be corrected with simple correction? Authors can be banned from submitting to the journal or other kinds of sanctions. Editors can, in some cases, provide information for editors and publishers, but again, and I think this is an issue worth discussing, there isn't as much sort of interaction amongst the publishers about specific cases. And we can, as a journal, publish an editorial in the journal to discuss the issue generally. So usually we wouldn't necessarily sort of highlight that particular paper, but if we feel like there's a certain kind of behavior that we're seeing more and more of, in order to raise awareness of the issue, we can publish an editorial. I think I'm probably over my 15 minutes. How am I doing for time? All right. Okay, I'll hurry. I wanted to put out there, and this is probably mainly for discussion later, sort of just some thoughts on what is going on. So why are we seeing these rise in misconduct, or even, in my opinion, there's definitely a rise in kind of sloppiness, and I see that over the 12 years that I've been at Self Press, just the degree to which papers come in and even go through the review process and have these sometimes silly errors but important ones is rising. So what's going on here? Is this an individual problem, or is there something about the way research is currently conducted or the research environment that's sort of leading to these issues? And I'll just put out some things that have been discussed as potentially factoring into more fraud or sloppiness. So one is lack of appropriate training and mentorship about good scientific practice. I mean, we all know that as scientists we're largely trained in an apprenticeship or almost osmosis kind of situation. And are we training new scientists in the field appropriately, or are scientists who aren't new to the field getting ongoing training for the new techniques and approaches and analytical methods that they need? People talk about high pressure, high stakes environments, that this puts more weight on answers than on the process. And some people even said high profile publications sort of raise the stakes and maybe even inadvertently promote fraud. Science is competitive, fast-paced, and again, the pressure to get results and publish is a big deal, a bigger deal than just getting your paper into press. It's about funding. It's about keeping your lab open. Does this sort of lead people to cut corners or even commit fraud? The nature of work relationships in labs. I mean, there are some labs where PIs only have a very indirect view of the results, and honest mistakes can quickly become major cases of fraud if people are trying to cover them up. Lack of accountability. I think that there is an assumption in some corners that it's hard to get caught, and when you do, there aren't that many penalties. The lack of institutional ethics, the feeling that everybody does this, so it seems to be okay. Large collaborations. I mean, how many people who have been on large collaborations really know what all of their collaborators are doing, or know them well enough to know whether you should trust them? Scientific blindsight. There have been some incredible cases of this in the larger community. I haven't seen so much of this in Cell Press, but this idea that, well, I'm sure my conclusions are right, and so it's okay for me to take shortcuts because this needs to get out there for the public good, the scientific good. Differences in cultural perceptions around what constitutes fraud and misconduct. And this is a big one as science has become more international. It's a hard one to talk about, but plagiarism is a good example. That plagiarism isn't considered to be a bad thing in all cultures. And then, to put out there, is it kind of human nature to cheat when you can? And we can debate that. None of these factors cause fraud or I think should be used as an excuse, but they're worth considering whether they contribute. And maybe I will skip off here, but I think towards the end it would be great to talk about as a group kind of what recommendations we can make for not just the publishers, but for institutions as a whole and the community as a whole. A few points that I would put out there is that we can't let even minor cases of misconduct get by, because I do think there needs to be a hard and fast policy that these are the ethical lines and you don't cross them. People need to know that for their careers, and when I give talks to students, I make that really clear, that just don't cross even the little line, because it's your scientific reputation is probably the biggest thing that you have as you move forward in your career. I think the importance of investigating bodies and policy bodies at institutions can't be underestimated, and those investigating bodies who put together committees at institutions to look at these cases of fraud, really need to pay close attention to their own process and to potential conflicts of interest within the institution on these committees. I mean, if you go back look online for some of the cases around the Duke case about a year or two ago, I mean, there was a lot that came out afterwards about how that case was handled by the institutional committee at Duke that was problematic. There needs to be transparency and I think really clear sanctions and penalties for all to see, and better mechanisms that we as publishers take towards letting the community know when cases of fraud and misconduct come up. So sorry that I went a bit long, but hopefully that's a good introduction. And I just wanted to put that up, since we're talking about ethics and attribution, is to give you some more resources where some of the early data that I talked about statistics about rise of fraud have come up, and to give some credit to places like the Society for Neuroscience and also JCB for some of the efforts that they've made to really publicize good practices around publication.
Thank you for the opportunity to come to Columbia to participate in this panel. Ethics, publications ethics, is something that the Society has dealt with for too many years. And what I'm here to do is to tell you a little bit about what processes we've undertaken and what we are seeing within the Society. I also wanted to make note, as you can see, APS is celebrating its 125th anniversary. And it's very nice to be able to be on the campus of Columbia University, because its origins, the origin of the APS, is Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, where John Green Curtis hosted the organizational meeting for the APS. And so I'm really pleased to be able to be here on the anniversary of the Society. Let me tell you a little bit about the APS. As I said, we were founded in 1887. We have about 11,000 members. We hold an annual meeting each year in the spring with sister societies in the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology. But the important thing is we publish scientific journals, and indeed we've been publishing since 1898, when the American Journal of Physiology started at Harvard University. Like many of us, our journals are all online. We use Highwire Press, and we went online in 1996 with our first journals. We scanned all the back content from 1898 to 1996, and that's available for the user community as a legacy product, but it gives you all the literature that we've ever published. We are also starting next year with our sister society, the Physiological Society. We're going to start an open access journal that'll be called Physiological Reports. Originally, myself and my counterpart were chuckling about the fact that the Royal Society and the Company of Biologists had not communicated with each other, and as a result there was a journal called Biology Open and another one called Open Biology that were created. I happened to tell my counterpart in the UK that, oh yeah, we just reserved the URL Physiology Open, and he proceeded to say, well, we just trademarked Open Physiology. And I said to Philip Wright, I said, you know, this is a little ridiculous. Why don't we try and do this together and create an international journal, open access journal for physiology, and hopefully it'll be launching early next year. One of the things I think that's important to know is societies generate revenue from their publications program. It's usually one of their primary sources of revenue. And the difference between commercial entities and societies is that money is reinvested in the membership in terms of training programs, awards, et cetera, designed to recognize the next generation of scientists. And as a result of those efforts, especially in the minority arena, we were given a Presidential Award for Excellence in Science, Math, and Engineering Mentoring back in 2003, something we would never have been able to do if we were just generating revenue from dues and meetings. Publications is a wonderful source of revenue to strengthen the field and the discipline for which we represent. Now, I was asked to talk about ethical cases within the APS, and it's clear from this slide that ethical cases have been, it doesn't work. Ethical cases have been increasing since 2007. And I will say ethical cases are anything in which the society has to lay a hand on it, communicate with an investigator. It is not just say, or Katja said, it's not something that truly and necessarily is something that was wrongly done. There is honest error here all over the place, but we have to touch it, we have to communicate. It is labor intensive and it takes a lot of time. Just as a point of reference, APS publishes between 3,000 and 3,500 papers a year. In 2011, we had 252 cases that we considered to be ethical cases. Concerns about publication, as Katja has indicated, has been in the literature for some time. APS has dealt with it. We wrote an editorial back in 2011, which basically said we have to do something about it. One of the things we ended up doing about it, because the number of cases had increased so dramatically in the amount of time that was devoted to it, we actually hired an ethics officer, a PhD physiologist, coincidentally, who joined us and is now responsible for managing the ethics cases with our committees and editors. So how did APS strengthen its publications ethics process? Clearly, it's a multifaceted effort. It involved publication staff, it involved the editors-in-chief, and it involved our publications committee. We referred to the guidelines issued by COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics. We referred to the CSE's white paper on promoting integrity in scientific journal publications. We held an ethics retreat with our editors. We developed flow charts, we developed template letters, and we developed art review processes. And I'll thank Mike Rosner and the folks at JCB and Rockefeller Press for helping to guide us in our art review process. So the question is, what can a journal do in the case of an ethical case? And obviously, the most obvious thing we can do is reject the paper. The problem with that, and I don't have an answer for it, but it is a problem that I hope we can discuss, is if I reject the manuscript, more than likely that paper is going to go down the street. Growing up in Chicago with corner groceries, I used to remember the checks that were taped to the window of the corner grocery store for the women or for the people who had bounced the check. And I keep wishing that we had a vehicle by which we could show those authors who had bounced the check, so to speak. But unfortunately, our attorneys don't like us to libel people in such way. Instead, we have Retraction Watch, which does show what's happened when a paper has been published and ultimately found to be an error. So the other option is alluded to is retracting the paper. You can prohibit future submissions, and indeed we do sanction authors. But once again, we don't put it up on the window to say Joe or Mary has been sanctioned and they can't publish for 2 years or 5 years in our journal. And is that punishment? Because, as I said, they can go down the street and publish somewhere else. More importantly, for the critical cases, we can report them to the institution, because indeed we can only do so much from our vantage point. It's really up to the institution to do the investigation to determine whether or not misconduct has occurred. And as I said, we seek guidance from multiple formats. The types of ethics that we deal with are much like the ones that were listed: figure manipulation, prior publication, duplicate publication, plagiarism, human and animal protocols, authorship, conflict of interest. For this talk, I'm going to focus mostly on presentation errors and fraud and fabrication. Presentation errors are what we see to the greatest degree, and it really becomes an education process in that case. This graph shows the types of cases we've had and how they're growing in 2010 and 2011. Gives you some numbers of what we've seen, but clearly the most significant is figure manipulation. Of the 252 cases that we saw in 2011, 192 of them related to figure manipulation. We try and educate authors, but as we all know, nobody reads instructions, whether it's in putting together that bike or how to publish a paper. We tell authors they should not move, remove, introduce, obscure, or enhance any specific feature within an image. We say authors should not adjust contrast, color balance, or brightness unless applied to the entire figure. If gels, blots, or fields are grouped or rearranged, then authors must insert spaces or dividing lines to indicate these changes and disclose the arrangement in the figure legend. Authors should not quantitatively compare samples from different gels, blots, and blots. If this is unavoidable, authors must state in the legend that all samples were derived at the same time and processed in parallel. And if an image of the same loading control is presented in multiple panels, this must be disclosed in the relevant legend. And once again, let me thank Cell Biology, the Journal of Cell Biology, for their assistance on this, as well as Nature. And we do publish these in our instructions for authors. One of the reasons why we've seen such a large increase in digital image manipulation is because we have instituted a process much like the Journal of Cell Biology. Article is accepted. Normally, it's immediately published online, and our article is in press in a manuscript type format, and published in print and online in the copy edited and formatted page. Early on, what we were doing is we would post the article in AIPS, and after the fact, after it was published, we would do the art review, discover a lot of these presentation errors, and have to publish a core agenda. Because the first publication, which most people considered to be a publication of note and of record, was problematic. We have modified our process. We've moved from doing the review after posting an article in press to reviewing the art after the article is accepted and before it goes up in Articles in Press. That reduces significantly the number of core agenda we have to put out. It doesn't change the number of cases of figure manipulation, but it avoids the embarrassment of having an author publish a manuscript with figures that have been manipulated, whether intentionally or not, and saves us with some of the difficulty, and adds probably no more than a week to the posting to the Articles in Press. We include within the submission document and guidelines, the form. We ask the corresponding author 3 main questions that relate to the process. First, adjustments to digital images have been declared in the figure and the legend. It's a reminder to consider that when they submit the manuscript. We ask whether the corresponding author indeed has seen the raw data and takes responsibility for the paper as a whole. Many of us who publish journals find the corresponding author blaming the postdoc or the graduate student or somebody from the collaborating laboratory without taking responsibility themselves. But as everyone knows, all authors are equally responsible for the content of the journal article. And even if you are added gratuitously as an author on a paper, if there's something wrong with it, you will be charged as well, and you will suffer sanctions as well. The listed authors have contributed to the manuscript and take responsibility for the contents of the manuscript. It's something that's critically important if you agree to be an author on a paper. So clearly the submission process helps educate the author. We've also established a number of courses and other activities. APS has a professional skills training course, which is held monthly. It's hosted live and online. We have courses that focus on writing and reviewing for journals, writing an abstract and creating a poster, networking at scientific meetings, and interviewing for academic positions. But most importantly, we tell them what is right and wrong when it comes to publishing a paper. A number of years ago, we created an ethics poster. It is available in multiple languages, and my president gave a publications workshop down in Brazil, and she took a number of posters in Portuguese. I'm going to China in November, and I will be taking a number of posters in China, because indeed there are cultures in which there are ethical challenges that we as publishers have to address because of the culture. So, has that been successful? I don't know. One data point doesn't convince anybody of anything, but at this point in time, in 2012, we've had 107 cases, and we are projecting 161 cases, about 90 less than we did in 2012. All I know is staff and editors hope maybe we're making a dent into people's thinking, or perhaps all those unethical authors are going to somebody else's journal, which I guess is okay. They're going to you. So one of the questions that I was asked when I was invited to participate here is, can ethical issues be addressed in OA? Interestingly, well, let me say I don't have an answer, okay? I can only give you one anecdote. An author, unnamed, submitted a manuscript to the American Journal of Physiology, Regulatory, Integrative, and Comparative Physiology. The editor, in looking at that paper, had some concerns and asked us, as we normally do, to run the manuscript through the ORI detection, forensic analysis. And it may or may not be easy to see, but what we ended up seeing is there, on the top band, there were 4 blots that were the same. On the second band, we had 2 groups of 3 that were identical, and 2 singles that were identical. On the third blot, where the arrows are, you can see sharp demarcations between the blots on the left and the blots on the right, which suggests that they were cut and pasted together. And when we went and asked the investigator for the original captures, which is what we would normally do, we received the capture below, which was lacking a number of the blots that were presented. Clearly, there was pasting that went on. And so we were able to decide, ultimately, sadly, to reject the paper because it was never published. This was in review. But the editor was curious. If this author did it in this paper, did he or she do it elsewhere? And so our editor did a search, probably in PubMed, to see if there were other papers published. And lo and behold, discovered the same author, same pattern, in other published work. And these two papers were in open access journals, PLOS One and BMC Cancer. We did the ORI analysis, and as you can see, we discovered duplicate bands, pasting of blots together. You can see on the right in the BMC Cancer, the backgrounds are all the same, where our uniform, whereas generally you don't find uniform backgrounds in blots. So clearly there was a pattern here of an author who was doing presentation errors, we don't know, manipulating the data before it was published. And at least in the case of these two journals, they were not ferreted out prior to the publication process. And so, is it a problem? I think it is. It's a real problem. If you look at all the OA journals that are coming to the forefront, some of which are going to be utilizing post-publication peer review, which suggests that a paper could be put out there, become part of the literature, without ethical problems being addressed and without adequate peer review. On that note, thank you, and I will be more than glad to answer questions at the end of the panel. Thank you.
Okay, being the third publisher out of 3, I will do my best not to be redundant in terms of what's already been said. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm Liz Williams. I'm the executive editor of the Journal of Cell Biology, which is one of 3 journals that's published by the Rockefeller University Press. The other 2 are the Journal of Experimental Medicine and the Journal of General Physiology. What I'm going to be focusing on in the next 15 minutes is what we've been doing at these journals to address image manipulation. So as you've just heard in the previous 2 talks, this is a major source of scientific misconduct. And it also turns out that at JCB in particular, we publish a lot of images. So being able to address image manipulation at the journal means we can address a lot of the problems that we see. I also want to hopefully give you a sense in the next 15 minutes that although this is a big problem and a lot of questions have been raised in the previous 2 talks about what we can do about this, there are actually some practical solutions that publishers can and should take to address image manipulation. So you've already seen some statistics about cases of image manipulation. I want to show another example here. So this is information from John Kruger at the Office of Research Integrity, looking at the number of cases that ORI is dealing with that have to do with questioned images. So these data were collected in 2-year periods starting in 1989, and the latest data came out from 2007 to 2008. So you can see that in 1989, there were very few cases, less than 5% of the cases that they were looking at that were dealing with questioned images. But look now ahead to 2007, 2008, and you're talking about more than 60% of their cases. So image manipulation is not a new phenomenon, but something like this tells you it's an increasingly visible one. So why do scientists manipulate images? Some of this has already been touched on, and I'll just give you our perspective on it. I think one of the major contributors is that we live in a culture where image manipulation is considered to be acceptable. So I'm showing you a quote here from 1994 from the managing editor of Time magazine at that time. He said, every major news outlet routinely crops and retouches photos to eliminate minor extraneous elements, so long as the essential meaning of the picture is left intact. Now that last phrase about the essential meaning of the picture is where things get very questionable, very ugly. There's a lot of gray there. And I also want to point out, this was a quote from 1994. This is very early in the Photoshop days. And if you look at popular media today, everything has been retouched before you see it. Most people don't even post photos to Facebook without even touching them up. So our culture, if anything, is accepting image manipulation more and more. And of course, that's going to be reflected in scientific culture. I think another reason that image manipulation happens is that it's extremely easy to do with tools such as Photoshop, which are now in just about everybody's hands. What we see a lot of is a contribution of something between naivete or ignorance or incompetence on the part of scientists. And this comes in sort of two flavors. First of all, there's a lot of misunderstanding on the part of scientists in terms of where the line is between what is acceptable and what's unacceptable. And there's also just a lot of misunderstanding about the actual tools that they are using, either to capture their images or to process them. And then, as other people have mentioned, there is probably in some cases a deliberate intent to deceive when scientists are manipulating images, but I do think that this is probably the minority of cases. So image manipulation happens, whether we like it or not, and the question then is, whose responsibility is it to detect it? And I would say that there are basically 5 major groups that we should consider. The principal investigators who are in the lab looking at the research itself, the reviewers looking at these data before publication, editors such as myself at journals, the readers of papers after publication, and then a group that I call citizen screeners, which is sort of an emerging group of people, some of whom have scientific training and some of whom don't, who are out there actually just trawling through the scientific literature looking for cases of image manipulation. I would say there are really only 2 groups out of these 5 that should be bearing the bulk of the responsibility. That is the principal investigators, who are the first line of defense in the lab, looking at the original data and making sure it is presented properly in a publication, and then editors such as myself. Now, this is not to say that reviewers and readers and citizen screeners don't play an important role in identifying cases of image manipulation, but as a whole, they are too heterogeneous of a group in terms of their training and their time commitment to do it systematically, which is really what has to be done. So what then is a journal's role in this? As has been touched on in the earlier talks, journals have a responsibility to their readers, to the scientific community, and to the public as a whole to do, I would say, 3 main things. It's our responsibility to ensure, to the best of our ability, that what our readers see is what the authors saw. It's our responsibility to ensure the quality of the science that we publish. And it's our responsibility to maintain the integrity of the scientific record. So when it comes to image manipulation, what does that mean for a journal? Well, we feel very, very strongly at the Rockefeller University Press that journals have responsibilities both before publication and after publication. Before publication, they have a responsibility to detect as much manipulation as possible. And unfortunately, most journals have not actually taken on this responsibility. In order to do this, there are 4 major elements that journals have to have in place. They have to have guidelines, screening, enforcement, and reporting. So in terms of guidelines, these are well-publicized guidelines about data presentation, as Marty just touched on for APS, and I will show you JCB's, which are very similar because theirs are derived from ours. A journal must have systematic screening and enforcement of those guidelines. Simply having guidelines without enforcing them is meaningless. And a journal must be willing to report cases of potential fraud to the relevant authorities. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and claim that JCB catches all cases of image manipulation that come through the door. So after publication, JCB, like every journal, has a responsibility to respond to all allegations that come their way, be they from an anonymous source or otherwise. So as I said, there are these 4 major elements: guidelines, screening, enforcement, and reporting. So what I'm showing here are JCB's guidelines for data presentation. These are publicly available on our website through our instructions for authors. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but I just want to emphasize, as Marty did, that it's very easy to put these guidelines out there. They're very straightforward. This doesn't have to be a complicated task. But just having the guidelines is not enough. So as I said, there must be screening, enforcement, and reporting. So JCB has been the industry leader in this case. We have been systematically screening all images in all editorially accepted papers for 10 years now. Whenever there is a potential violation of our guidelines, we investigate that, and we do revoke acceptance of papers when unacceptable manipulation is detected. And when appropriate, we also will report authors to their institution. So now to give you a little bit of practical information about how we actually do this. I don't want this to seem as if it's a very complicated task that journals can't take on. It really is very straightforward. What we use for our image screening is Adobe Photoshop. This is the preferred tool for manipulating your images, and it's also what we've found to be the most reliable tool for detecting manipulation. In very practical terms, how do we do this? We have a production editor who screens each image in every paper manually. She does very simple dynamic brightness and contrast adjustments, levels adjustments, to look for any atypical or inconsistent pixels in an image. Now, very importantly, this person is not trained in science because her job is purely to look for atypical pixels. She also will do manual visual scans to look for duplicated data, and just a general unbiased scan of the figures to look for anything out of the ordinary, any red flag. Now, in terms of the actual commitment that a publisher has to make to do this type of screening, it is not all that large. So at the Rockefeller University Press, we publish about 700 papers per year across our 3 journals, and we have the equivalent of 1 full-time person who does all of this screening. That's really not asking a lot of a publisher. So what do we then do? After we've done the screening, how do we enforce our guidelines? The first step is to ask for the original data from the authors, and this can be in the form of unmodified microscopy files, radiographic films, whatever data underlie the figure that we're looking at. At this point, a trained scientist has to be involved, and it's a trained scientist who looks at those data and the prepared figure. And the reason you need a trained scientist involved is that there are different kinds of manipulation. So the bulk of what we see is what we call inappropriate manipulation. This is manipulation that does not affect the interpretation of the data, but it does violate our guidelines for data presentation. The resolution here is very straightforward. The authors remake their figures using the original data in such a way that our guidelines are followed. In a much smaller number of cases, we see what we call fraudulent manipulation. So this is fabrication or falsification that actually affects the interpretation of the data. And this is why a scientist has to be involved, to actually look at those data, look at the manipulation, and ask whether it has undermined any of the conclusions. If we find that any conclusion in a paper is undermined by the manipulation, we revoke acceptance. So now the question is, how big of a problem is this actually, and is this worth doing? So JCB has been doing this systematically for 10 years, and to my knowledge, this is the only set of data, a systematic study of image manipulation at a journal over time in an unbiased manner. What we have seen over these 10 years is that about half of our authors have to remake at least one figure. And that can be for as simple a reason as one of the images isn't high enough resolution for us to actually do our screening. Or it can be something much more complicated. More than 15% of our authors have to provide some level of original data for assessment. And this can be anything from a single film to dozens and dozens of images. It really depends on the case. And then the critical number here is that 1% of all editorially accepted papers at JCB end up having acceptance revoked, or the authors withdraw the paper once we start asking questions. So that might not seem like a very big number, but let me give you the actual raw numbers here. So in 10 years, we have screened 3,478 papers. We've requested original data in 572 cases, and we have revoked acceptance, or the authors have withdrawn 37 papers. So in asking how big of an issue this is, I would ask you what the ramifications to the scientific community might have been if JCB had published about 4 papers per year in which at least one of the conclusions was not supported by the data. So there's a point I want to make about these data that we've been collecting over 10 years. And that is that this 1%, this frequency of fraudulent image manipulation, has remained completely constant over 10 years at JCB, despite the fact that we are very, very vocal about our image screening policies. So one interpretation of that might be that systematic screening is not actually a deterrent. And so that might discourage some journals from doing this. But I would like to emphasize that the fact that it's not a deterrent does not undermine the responsibility that journals have to protect the scientific record. So this is something that needs to be done. So I just want to briefly mention another initiative we have at JCB to promote image integrity. JCB launched in 2008 the JCB Data Viewer. This is a browser-based system for actually hosting the original image data that underlie our published images. So now, instead of readers just having to look at a small 2D version of a figure in a PDF, they can actually go in and look at and interact with the original data underlying some of those figures, which really allows the reader to ask, do these data represent what the authors actually are showing? So as was mentioned before, image manipulation is just one kind of fraud, and I really want to emphasize, although there are very practical things that journals can do to look at image manipulation and prevent it, and although this is a major source of scientific misconduct, this is only a fraction of what is out there. So what I've been talking about here is detecting post-acquisition image manipulation. But image manipulation can occur upstream of that too. It can occur at the stage at which you decide how to take a picture of something, or it can occur at the stage where you decide whether to take a picture of something. And that's something that we unfortunately cannot screen for. Importantly, images are only one form of scientific data. Graphical data, numerical data, there simply are no easy tools for screening these for manipulation. And data manipulation is, of course, only one form of misconduct, as you've heard in the previous two talks. Plagiarism, failure to obtain regulatory board approval, all of these things are things that journals have to be on the lookout for. But between plagiarism and image manipulation, these are two major forms of scientific misconduct that journals see, and they're actually two forms of misconduct that we can detect through very practical measures. That's it. Thank you.
As the only non-scientist on the panel, I'd like to start by saying you're not going to see so many pictures in these slides. Lawyers being more text-oriented sometimes. Let's see. Okay. So, and being a lawyer, I'm going to start with what are the rules. Because institutions, as institutions, we are governed by rules and regulations that tell us what to do when, as you hear, a journal editor or a journal reader or a graduate student or a faculty member or a peer reviewer comes to us and says, I think there might be a problem. And in 2000, the Office of Science and Technology Policy developed a sort of overarching policy that was supposed to be implemented by all of the federal granting agencies with respect to research misconduct. And so thereafter, the Public Health Service issued its policies on research misconduct. The National Science Foundation adopted parallel policies. FDA is now actually proposing its own regulations, and each of these entities has adopted regulations that are very consistent in some ways, but that have nuanced variations. So for us as institutions, it can be complicated. All of these federal level regulations require us to establish an institutional policy. So we all have such policies, and they generally track the regulations in one way or another, as ours does. The definition, as Katja mentioned, the regulatory definition that most of us have adopted is what we call FF&P, fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism. And I want to point out that the definition spans the whole lifespan of the project, from proposing research to the final published manuscript. So we have, on occasion, institutions receive concerns raised by a granting agency reviewing a proposal, where there's a concern that the proposal itself, before any research has even been conducted, somehow contains research misconduct, either plagiarism or some other kind of research misconduct, and even in the reviewing process, someone who is reviewing proposals for a federal agency can also be found to have committed research misconduct if, for example, they plagiarize something that they've reviewed. So what do those words mean that we in this research misconduct context focus on within the institution? Well, again, there are regulatory definitions that we look at: fabrication, making up data or results; falsification, the manipulation that you've been hearing about of images, but it could also be other kinds of manipulation of equipment or of processes to conduct research so that the research is not accurately represented; and then plagiarism, which you've also heard about already. So these are the way that Columbia characterizes or defines these terms, but like I said, this is really how the federal regulations define these terms, and as federally funded institutions, we're obligated to have policies that conform to the regulations. So what is not research misconduct is just as important, and again, because as an institution we have very specific and structured processes that we follow for research misconduct, it's important for us to be able to explain what is not included. And so you've heard about honest error and differences of opinion over data interpretation. Authorship disputes are not issues that institutions typically will handle through a research misconduct process, and we don't. Other kinds of violations or bad behavior, again, not research misconduct where we have very specific processes. These issues, those kinds of violations need to be addressed through an appropriate institutional channel, but it just wouldn't be this one. So what is that process that I've been alluding to? Well, it has a number of phases that would begin with a written allegation. And at our institution, we require a written allegation. It must include some basis for why there's a belief that the issue that's been observed or the concern is in fact or could be research misconduct. And when we get an allegation like that, after we do kind of an initial assessment to make sure that they really are talking about potential research misconduct and not one of those other kinds of issues, the first step is to convene an inquiry committee. And so the first phase of this process is what we call an inquiry. Again, it's a regulatory term. It's a preliminary review. It's a quick look to determine whether there's a need for a further investigation. Then a potential second phase is an investigation. After that, there's an adjudication, which is where the institution ultimately, a person vested with authority to do so, adjudicates whether there's an actual finding or not. And if there is a finding, at our institution there may be an appeal. So I want to spend a little bit of time just describing what happens at particularly the inquiry phase and then the investigation phase. And each of these are carried out by a faculty committee. So we find people with the relevant expertise. We assure that they do not have conflicts of interest, and we have an SOP that we follow for that. And they are doing this in addition to their full-time work at Columbia, and sometimes this can be very time-consuming, and it can even just the scheduling alone can be challenging. So at the inquiry stage, as I said, it's a quick look. It's kind of like the grand jury. It's looking to see whether the allegation has substance and whether a full investigation is warranted. And we have a committee that will look at that and ultimately draft a report with a recommendation. At our institution, we have an overarching standing committee that then can accept or reject that report. So if there's a recommendation to carry out a full investigation, we move into a much more formal and exhaustive examination of the research record. And in parallel with that inquiry, in fact, one of the very first things that we do upon receiving an allegation is figure out what are the research records here and how can we collect them. So there is an obligation, again, under the regulations and in our policy, for us to go out and collect whatever research records may be relevant to this case. That could be lab notebooks, that could be copies of somebody's hard drive, that could be printouts. There are any number of records that we may gather, and in some big cases, there may be thousands of pages of documents that we ultimately collect and electronic files that need to be reviewed. So in an investigation, those materials are analyzed, and in addition, people are interviewed. So you heard that typically and under the regulations and our policy, there is an intent requirement. The action has to have been, for it to be research misconduct, the person has to have done it intentionally or recklessly. And that means that the investigators have to talk to that person and also to other people who may have worked with that person or who may have observed certain kinds of things, or who may have never observed anything. All of those kinds of issues come into play at this level. The investigation is conducted by a whole new faculty committee, again, a committee of experts in the area. At times, we may go outside the institution to have an expert from outside become part of the committee. It is an enormous undertaking, as anyone who's participated in this kind of process. It is exhaustive, and it also results ultimately in a report. Now, the investigation report may be anywhere from 20 to 100 pages long, depending on the scope, depending on the nature, depending on whether there are findings or not. They often have figures in them, explanations, examples. If there is a finding that somebody actually fabricated or falsified data, how can we show that? How can we see that? Here's the before and here's the after of the manipulated output from the research, or here's the raw data and here's the data that was put into the Excel sheet that was ultimately used to generate the statistics that are published. So it is a very painstaking and careful process, and again, it is one that takes time. In some cases, we've had cases that have spanned research that was conducted over 5 or 6 years, many different publications in many journals. An investigation like that takes time. Ultimately, again, this report is reviewed by at our institution, our overarching standing committee on the conduct of research, and then the final phase would be the adjudication at our institution. That's by our executive vice president for research, who has before him the report, the recommendation from the standing committee, and any comments to the report by the complainant, the person raising the issue in the first place, and also the respondent. And each of those individuals has the opportunity to comment on the drafts of all of these reports. So it is a process-laden process, and I can say that as a lawyer. And there are a lot of safeguards that we abide by to try and ensure that it's a fair process. Because, as you've also heard and as everyone knows, the consequences of findings of research misconduct, or even an allegation of research misconduct, can be so significant. And that's why confidentiality of this process is also so critical. So there can be a period where a journal may come to us with a concern, and we may say, okay, we have a process, we have a policy, here it is, we're going to treat your concern in accordance with our process, and then we may not be able to say anything until we complete this process. And you'll see when a little later, I'll talk about the notifications that an institution may be involved with at the end of the process. But there can be this sort of lag time, and it can be frustrating to many people involved because people want to know what's going on. But we, on the institution side, we can't really talk about it. There are many limitations on what we could share, even to acknowledge that, for example, there is an investigation as opposed to an inquiry could potentially be a breach of confidentiality. So we're very careful about that. And that is to protect everyone, not only the person raising the issue and the person against whom the issue is raised, but also people participating in the process, witnesses, committee members, and so on. Specific safeguards that we have in place that are, again, in our policy for the complainant is overall, treat them fairly and reasonably, protect the complainant from retaliation, and that's absolutely critical. So as an institution, Columbia has an overall policy not to tolerate retaliation. In this context, it's especially important, and we're very attentive to that. And then if there are ever concerns, and sometimes there could be concerns that the complainant might have about their own reputation for having raised an issue, that diligent efforts would be made to protect or restore for that person. The respondent is also entitled to significant protections, and starting with the presumption of innocence. So, you know, our starting place as we start collecting all of these records and putting all these committees together, and the starting place for each of the committees is this person is presumed not to have committed research misconduct. And then burden of proof is on the institution to show that the person did. They have to be protected from penalty and public knowledge until they're found culpable. So this goes back to the confidentiality that I mentioned. And in general, they're entitled to continue working, to continue to function in the university, unless there's some compelling and exceptional situation. A finding of research misconduct has to meet certain requirements, and these are, again, regulatory and incorporated in our policy. So there has to be a significant departure from accepted practices in the relevant research community. And that's important because from where I sit, I'm a university-wide role, medical center, non-medical center issues, and there are different practices in different disciplines. So members of the discipline in the committees will be able to make that kind of assessment. There is this intent requirement. The action has to have been taken intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly. And that is hard to prove. But it has been proven. It can be proven in some cases. And I think, you know, it's right that it's hard to show because it goes to the heart of really what we're trying to do here. And then finally, there is a standard of evidence that applies, and this is a legal term, the preponderance of the evidence. The preponderance of the evidence has to show that there should be a finding of research misconduct. So that means it really comes down to more likely than not. Does the evidence show more likely than not that this person intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly falsified or fabricated or plagiarized? It's the civil standard, not the criminal standard. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. So, you know, that too can sometimes be troubling or difficult. In those instances where a finding is made, we do provide notifications and under our policy and under the regs, but this again occurs only at the end of the process. And journals are, of course, among those to whom a notification might be required. But But typically, we will reach out to, in a situation like this, I think institutions will typically reach out to the corresponding author, assuming that person is not necessarily involved with the case. And you know, it's an awkward position in some ways for the institution because we typically don't involve ourselves between authors and journals. We typically rely on authors and journals to talk to each other. So there's some awkwardness for the institution to, on the one hand, ensure that the scientific record, the literature is appropriately remedied where there's an issue without sort of stepping on the toes of the authors and the journals in their process. So we will provide information and be available for consultation. But also, our report itself may remain confidential. So the journal sometimes might want to see the report, and we might not be able to provide it, or we might provide an excerpt or a redacted version because of the sensitivities that are involved. Now, ultimately, if there's a finding of research misconduct under HHS-funded research, the report goes to the Office of Research Integrity, which does its own review, and if they make a finding, they will publish that in the Federal Register. Retraction Watch and some of those blogs, that's one of their sources, is the Federal Register. And on occasion, there are folks who will FOIA the federal agencies for information about these cases. So that's another way that sometimes information ends up being revealed. The sanctions. What are the sanctions if someone is found to have committed research misconduct after one of these processes? Well, from the federal side, there are voluntary kinds of resolutions, and then there are involuntary resolutions. And the voluntary resolutions can involve exclusions and settlements with the government where someone might agree voluntarily not to apply for funding for a certain period of time, not to serve on advisory committees to the funding agencies or peer review, to work under supervision for some period. There is also debarment. And so sometimes the outcome of a finding of research misconduct is that an individual is barred from eligibility for any federal funding or participation in any process, advisory or study section or any other such process for some period of time. It can be 1 year, it can be 3 years, it can be 5 years, depending on the severity. On the university side, there are other kinds of sanctions that could ultimately end up being invoked, and of course, those sanctions have to go through university processes that are, you know, in some cases it may be separate from a research misconduct investigation. But those kinds of things could be retraction of degrees for if there are graduate students who are found to have falsified portions or significant portions of their thesis. It could be, there could be other kinds of sanctions as well, but again, these are the kinds of things that typically, as is typical for institutions in general, there are layers of process. So for those of you in the room who may be students or postdocs or faculty at Columbia and wonder what to do if you have a concern or a suspicion, there are a number of different avenues, but you know, you should talk to someone. And there are lots of places where you can go. If you can't talk to the researcher themselves or colleagues that you trust, department chairs, leadership, there's always my office. We counsel people. We talk through issues. We talk through hypothetical questions, and we're happy to do that. Columbia's Ombuds Office similarly can provide some help there. And at many institutions, including Columbia, we have a compliance hotline where people can make anonymous reports. So there are avenues, and I think it's a very difficult situation to be in, so folks should know they're not alone. this is the only picture in my slides. This is our website, and there's lots of information about how this process works here.
So I'd like to invite our panelists to take seats up in front, and then we'll open the floor for questions and discussion. There's a microphone now in the center of the room, so if you have a question, move to the microphone. While everyone, go ahead.
Communicate with journals, and it might be very helpful for us if your committees did communicate with journals and didn't just rely on the authors to communicate with us.
Actually, I didn't say we don't. I said that we do it in coordination with the authors. So what can happen and has happened is a letter might go to a corresponding author, and another letter might go to the editor of that journal outlining the same issues, just so that that editor is aware. And then we would work together with the corresponding author, hopefully, to try and address the issue. But if there's, I mean, ultimately the institution is very concerned that the literature be corrected, and if there's a lack of responsiveness, then we will go directly to the journal if we need to.
So Mike kind of asked my question, so I'll ask a different one, which is Marty, you commented a bit about the open access policy. Would you say that that was a question of the journals being open access that allowed for this, or that there was, in those cases, a lower threshold for some kind of review process that was going on, and that could happen open access or not?
It could happen whether it's open access or not. Clearly, it's a function of the rigor that the publisher puts into ensuring that the scientific literature is correct. As Liz indicated, Liz in Journal of Cell Biology has been at the forefront. I think you have three of us up here whose publications philosophy are to ensure the integrity of science. Sadly, there are over 5,000 scientific journals published. I don't think most scientific publishers undergo the same level of rigor that we undergo when we look at a paper. Many of them do spot checks. I think that's good, but I think it's critically important to look at all the figures with respect to figure manipulation. With respect to open access, I think we have seen such a flood of new journals coming into the marketplace that are open access, with the primary incentive of to try and hold down author processing charges and to publish the paper as quickly as possible, that the time necessary to ferret out problems is not necessarily there, or not necessarily in the interest of some publishers. And as such, I think we run the risk of seeing an increasing number of problems. Others?
Like, I guess I have a related comment, but it's not so much specifically about open access journals, but an interesting other development in the field of scientific communication is this idea of preprint servers. Just put the stuff out there and buyer beware, and let the community validate it, and we don't need publishers at all. And I guess I sit on the other side of that and agree with the other speakers here that there's much that publishers bring to the scientific communication process, obviously, but one thing is to ensure the sanctity of the record. And I think an issue that isn't discussed a lot with these ideas of institutional repositories, preprint servers, pre-publication is, who is vetting quality around those records? And they are out there just as much as the published papers are. So just wanted to put that out there.
The only thing I would add is just that we need to differentiate the quality of peer review from the quality of post-peer review checking of the sort that I was talking about in my talk, that Marty was talking about in terms of what they're doing as well. There are some very rigorous journals out there in terms of peer review that are not doing image checking, plagiarism checking, things like that. So I think we need to make sure we're very clear about distinguishing open access versus rigor of peer review versus other types of screening.
I'd like to return to an issue that was touched on briefly, and that is, in modern science, so much of the work is collaborative, and there may well be authors on a paper who are responsible for very technical matters, such as statistical analysis or very highly specialized chemical analyses. How are the responsibility of the other authors viewed by journals? I was raised as an absolutist that every author was responsible for every word in the paper. And one of my very first papers as a graduate student, I cited a journal article that was only available in French. And my PhD advisor was incredibly concerned over whether I read French well enough to absolutely know that article well enough to cite it. But the situation has changed a lot with all of these new techniques. No one is an expert in all of them. So how does this pertain to authors' responsibilities?
As I think I indicated, it is critically important that all authors are familiar with the content of the article, because if there is a problem, at least for APS, and I think most of the two other publishers up here, each author is held accountable for the content of that paper. Unfortunately, I think science has become big. I got my doctorate centuries ago in 1973, when you actually had to calculate data yourself and analyze printouts and things of that nature. Now, so much comes out via a computer algorithm that too many of the investigators really don't know what goes into that algorithm. And too many PIs don't spend enough time in the laboratory to talk with their graduate students, postdocs, and technicians to actually figure out what they're doing in the lab and how the data is being acquired. And so I think there is a real risk that we become too big in science, the research groups have become too big, and the potential for malfeasance exists out there.
I mean, I would also say that in the end, if a journal chooses to retract a paper, they retract the paper. They don't retract one author on the paper. The entire paper is retracted. I think that there's sensitivity around some of those issues in that we do attempt to work with the authors on the paper in the retraction statement, and in that statement that there can be a subtlety to it that makes clear who was responsible for which experiments or which experiments are in question. But the paper as a whole is retracted, and so I do think investigators should be aware that when you're entering collaborations, you rise with it and you fall with it. And I think probably as important as having a technical awareness of the data in the paper is knowing your collaborators and sort of the ethical mores that your collaborators hold. I mean, I had a situation where it was 3 collaborating labs on a paper that had issues that ultimately led to retraction that fell around figure manipulation, and it was just 2 of the co-authors were just stunned at the co-author who was responsible for that piece of data. But they all went through the process together. It was extremely difficult for all authors involved, especially the authors who just felt like they had been blindsided by this, but learned a good lesson, I think. But ultimately, the whole paper is retracted, not an individual author.
But to follow up, some journals now require statements as to who did what. Right. And these strike me as get-out-of-jail-free cards of a kind. It gives people an excuse to say, I wrote, I did X. I'm not responsible for Y.
And we don't currently have those at Cell Press, although I have to say that personally I'm in favor of them. I mean, probably for other reasons. I think that there are papers where if you had that level of statement, what would float to the top would be the persons who really did nothing on the paper, right? Who were on it just gratuitously. And I mean, I think the case that showed this quite well was the stem cell papers in Science, where there were tons of corresponding authors on those papers, and they just fell off as soon as trouble arose, right? So I think knowing your collaborators for bigger reasons than just publication is really important. You're standing by their data as much as you're standing by your own.
Go ahead. Okay, thanks. My question is about what happens after the paper is after a paper is retracted, and really around the issue of retracted papers continue to be cited, and is there any mechanism, I wonder, whereby you're vetting the papers you get to see their citations? Are they citing retracted papers?
I can speak to that. I mean, our production department has a system in place to check all citations to make sure they do not refer to retracted papers, or if they do, they make it clear that the data were retracted. So a paper published in any of our journals cannot refer to data in a retracted paper as fact. You can refer to the fact that the paper was retracted, but that's all.
Okay. And that's the case across the board?
I think that's in general the same thing. The biggest problem is keeping track of all the papers that are retracted.
Right.
And as you know, there was a study recently done, I think Phil Davis did the study, to look at the publication record and whether or not journals have the retractions appropriately noted, whether PubMed has appropriate linkages to core agenda and retracted papers. And it's not 100%, unfortunately.
It was pretty high, actually. I think it's something.
It was about 70%.
Yeah, large number.
But it wasn't 100%.
Okay. Another question along a slightly different tack. Do you think that the adoption of data management plan requirements, and as those maybe move towards having teeth on the end, do you think those will help improve the situation around at least making it easier to have that sort of post-peer review process and ensure the data are not being overly massaged or manipulated?
It will certainly help with investigations, yes. Okay. I don't know that it will prevent any problems or reduce them, but the number of authors I've dealt with who say we can't find the data is quite high, and unfortunately for us, that means we revoke acceptance if you cannot find the original data. So, for some authors, it will save them if they can actually find the original data and respond properly to our questions.
Okay, thank you.
Could I just ask a quick question of my panelists? As I indicated, APS had 252 cases last year, which we considered ethical. We actually only sanctioned 8 investigators, 8 author groups. When we sanction all the authors. And I'm curious whether or not the same is true for both of your publications.
We do not sanction or blacklist people.
We would, but we haven't in my recent memory.
And as I said, we sanction usually anywhere from 1 to 5 years, depending on the severity. But as I indicated in my comments earlier, that sanction only means that Joe or Mary can't submit another manuscript to the APS. They can't review either. They can go to other journals, and we have no way of communicating that to the community, and I think that's one of the failings, and I'm not sure my attorneys would let me just post it on our website.
Would you have referred all of those cases back to the author's institution?
Yes, we usually do, yeah.
Yes, I wanted to ask some questions from the other end of the process, from that of the clinical papers. And part of my background outside of Columbia is with pharmaceutical ad agencies that do not do the TV ads and big pharma. Most of this, I think, is asking Mr. Palmer. The sloppiness is sometimes generated by language. Often there are abstracts that, because of grammatical errors, are going to put out of business codeine or something. This seems to be something unchanging in my sense. And I'm not sure that grammatical grasp and the like are better now than they were 20 years ago. So that's rather a comment. As for plagiarism, my experience, and I think those people who have taught have the same experience, can be almost accidental. I remember trying to track down a Russian article from 1909, and the New York Academy didn't have it. And then Google came to mind. This was some time ago. And lo and behold, it was a quite elderly doctor who was quoting a paragraph from a previous publication of his with this 1909 Russian whatever, and it was published by a major medical publishing house. So I had a little chat with his secretary about whether this was truly essential, and I'm sure you have anecdotes of that sort where there was really no intent. I want to make a comment, and actually I'd like to hear from the group of you. Industry, big pharma, in many cases has copy reviews, and this may suggest something of the usefulness of FDA regulation. I don't know how many of you know what this entails, but usually it's all the writers, whether they're in-house or ad agencies, all the in-house editors, there can be one or two, a product director, a product manager, because for whatever the drug is, the drug developer, at least one MD, a lawyer who's often silent for reasons I've never understood, and matters are gone through line by line and word by word for both promotional, from the FDA's point of view, and non-promotional materials. Now, what wasn't covered in any of this but is mentioned is the effort, it's mentioned in falsification, the deletion of materials. I mean, now that we have clinical trials more or less online, that there's less of that, and data on file in many cases have to be assumed. But with those two provisos, it seems to me at least that in the experience of some of us, industry has tried very, very hard to do something that is true and within the regulations. So I'd like your reactions.
Certainly, as someone who runs a laboratory, the question of what piece of data is data that disproves what hypothesis we hold dear, and what is a glitch from something that just was done wrong is critically important. It's what keeps you awake, because if you leave out the critical piece of information that told you you were wrong, you'll obviously never know you were wrong. And a large number of the cases that I know of in the literature have to do with pieces of data that were ignored, that would have told people that there was a problem with the conclusions they were drawing. And it's not only that people are kind of consciously making the decision to hide this data. Of course, people are, in many cases, are trying to draw a line between what's noise, what's a glitch, and what's real. And it's easy to draw the line on the side of the boundary, that favors what you're hoping for. So I think that's a terrifically difficult problem, and made even larger by the quantity of data one acquires now. Mm-hmm. One acquires so much data that it's virtually impossible to look at every single peak or every single measurement. And then, of course, one starts to rely, as Mari said, on automated procedures for evaluating the data. And then, of course, any glitch in the automated procedure leads to problems down the road. So I don't have an answer to that other than the fact that also was alluded to, the corresponding authors have to sit down and look at the raw data. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Other comments on this topic?
I mean, I agree it's an incredibly hard issue that I think independent of the misconduct issues that we as editors deal with often. When you especially have cases where papers are revised and resubmitted, and authors are asked to address certain questions, and it's frequent that people will come back and say, well, we tried the experiment, but it didn't work. So what does that really mean? The other place it does come up, again, it's somewhat related to, but also separate from misconduct, is it's not unheard of that journals get allegations that are more about, well, we couldn't replicate that paper, so it should be retracted, or it's fraudulent. And inability for another lab to replicate a paper is not the same as fraudulence or misconduct. Those still need to be looked at carefully by the journals, but it only in some cases will evolve into an ethical misconduct issue. So, but it's challenging. I mean, I think willfully removing data that speaks against your conclusions is in that gray zone of bad behavior, but only in some cases would it be sort of an ethical.
I had a question for Veronique Kermer with Nature Publishing Group for Naomi. We've talked a little bit, several panelists have talked about the importance of training and mentoring in avoiding and in finding those sources of misconduct. You've talked about the consequences for people who are found to have committed misconduct. I was wondering what, in your experience here at Columbia, or if you know from other universities, what are the consequences, or what are the measures that are put in place after that for the laboratory, for the PI in whose labs misconduct happened and all that? Is there some form of constructive dealings with these situations after the fact?
Mm-hmm. So it's a great question that really goes kind of, as you say, beyond the research misconduct regulatory procedure that we in my office worry about and have responsibility for, that really goes to the nature of the mentoring and the teaching and the supervision. I think, most institutions look to that as a kind of provostial issue, and there can be steps that can be taken by a department or a school or a dean or a provost to look at those kinds of questions, and perhaps to make recommendations about changes or remediation or training or other kinds of things. I think it is case specific, and I think institutions vary in how they handle it. And because that side of things is not regulated, from my perspective, since my role is primarily a regulatory role, I have less involvement with that side. Although someone in my kind of role, at a research institution, is often asked for just advice and informal counsel. What's a good approach? How should this be addressed?
Now we've reached 2 o'clock, so we have time for one last question. I see someone about to get up.
Yeah, Hi, I actually have a question from Twitter for you, Martin. So Irene Hames, who works in the UK as a peer review specialist, she's interested in the APS's ethical officer role. She's just wondering about the details of that role. What does that involve?
Most of the ethical cases we deal with have been dealt with previously through our committee structure, and staff does the investigation. The committee addresses the issues. We just found it becoming such a burden on volunteer staff or volunteer members of committees. One of the things I tell my directors is that all their committees and all their committee chairs are serving as volunteers. They actually have full-time jobs for which they get paid, and it's incumbent on us to minimize the load on their on them so that they can do what they're really getting paid to do. So we decided it was important to bring a person in-house to help to do the investigations and ferret out the problems, do the communications with the authors to get the original capture data when needed, communicate with the institution where appropriate, et cetera.
So join me in thanking all of our panelists, and I'm sure they'll be welcome to continue the discussion after a formal close of today's session.